Nirvana says. And then hit that for in streaming.
Are we gonna get some audio now though? Well, maybe, do I hear it? This is where it's actually, oh, here. You hear it.
Yeah.
If you're actually
Background,
watching, you hear it, okay.
Yeah.
Are we gonna get some audio now though? We are gonna get some audio now though.
Look at plurality voting from a more mathematical perspective, we find that it actually has some important flaws. So one of the first issues with plurality voting is something called vote splitting. And vote splitting is when similar candidates split the vote, and that way an unpopular or a fringe candidate can actually end up winning. So here's an example that I am sure you have heard about. In the 2016 Republican primary, we're going to talk about 4 of the candidates, so Trump, Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich. And here is how the vote count ended up. So you can see that Trump has the most votes, but he has less than 50%. And then the rest of the vote is split between the other 3 candidates. And polling actually suggested that the people voting for the other 3 candidates were all in the same category and probably would have preferred one of those 3 candidates over Trump. So we say that that group of voters had their votes split between those 3 candidates, and that is how Trump was able to win, even though he didn't have support from the majority of Republican voters. All right, so vote splitting has been a little bit of a topic with regards to the 2024 elections. So this guy right here is Larry Hogan, and he used to be the governor of Maryland, and he's sort of a moderate Republican. And so people were asking him whether or not he was going to run in the 2024 elections because they were hoping that he would run against Trump. But he actually said, no, I'm not going to run because I don't want to split the anti-Trump vote. So at this point, there were already some non-Trump candidates in the race. There was DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Ramaswamy. If you've heard about any of those people, you know that they are Republican candidates and that they are running against Trump. And he did not want to potentially take votes away from them and split the anti-Trump vote. In the end, Trump is polling over 50%, so it looks like it's not really going to matter, but it's still interesting to see how concerns about vote splitting are impacting candidates' behaviors in our election. Then we can also talk about vote splitting in House elections. So this is the results from the Democratic primary for U.S. House District 4, which includes Wellesley, Massachusetts. And it's from 2020. And so you can see that the guy who won with just 22% of the vote. And then there's these 3 other candidates who were all sort of close to that, but lost because they had just a little bit less. And it turns out that these 3 other candidates actually split the progressive vote. And that's how this guy was able to win and go on to become the representative, even with not that much support within the party. All right, so another issue with plurality voting is called the spoiler effect. So the spoiler effect is when a candidate who doesn't actually have a chance to win the election still causes the election results to change. And a great example is from the 2000 presidential election in Florida. And later, Cammy will talk about the Electoral College. And because of the Electoral College, this election result actually determined the overall election result as well. So we'll talk about 3 candidates in this election. There was George Bush for the Republican Party, Al Gore for the Democratic Party, and Ralph Nader for the Green Party. So here is how the votes ended up looking. And you can see that George Bush has the most votes, but you can also see that Al Gore just has a few hundred less. And then Ralph Nader has over 90,000. And as it turns out, if you think about their policies, a lot of the supporters of Ralph Nader would have voted for Al Gore instead if Ralph Nader had not been in the election. And since there was 90,000 of them, and it only would have taken a few hundred to give Al Gore enough votes to beat Bush, We say that Ralph Nader was a spoiler for Al Gore because his presence in the election took away enough votes who would otherwise have gone to Al Gore that Bush was able to win instead. So spoilers are a big issue in 2024, and both parties are concerned about them. So there's a few independent or third-party candidates running. If you've heard of Robert Kennedy or Cornel West, they're both third-party candidates that have announced. And initially, the Democratic Party was concerned about Robert Kennedy, but now the Republican Party is actually very concerned about his campaign because they think it's possible that he will take enough votes from people who would otherwise have voted for Trump that Biden will win instead. Then there is an organization called No Labels, and this is their actual logo. It's kind of fun. And the Democratic Party and the Biden campaign are very concerned about no labels. They haven't announced their candidate yet, but when they do, the Biden campaign is worried that that candidate might be able to attract enough votes from people who would have otherwise voted for Biden that Trump would be able to win in important states. All right, so we've talked about some of the problems with plurality voting, and we also want to think about how those issues are impacting our elections. So there is something called Duverger's law, which basically just says that plurality voting discourages third-party candidates and third parties from existing. And there's a few reasons for that. So the first one is spoiler concerns, and that means that a candidate from a third party might decide not to run because they don't want to be a spoiler for whichever candidate they prefer. And then the other issue is on the voters' side, and that is favorite betrayal. And this is when a voter decides not to vote for their favorite candidate because they don't want to waste their vote on somebody who doesn't really have a chance to win the election. And so you can see this has impacts on both candidate behavior and on voter behavior in ways that are going to discourage third-party candidates and third parties from succeeding. And that's unfortunate because can someone help me get this to work? Oh, I got it. Thanks. That is unfortunate because there's actually pretty significant popular support for moving away from a two-party system, but plurality voting is just one of the things that makes that a little bit more difficult. Then there's another issue with plurality voting in our elections, and that is negative campaigning. So under plurality voting, candidates don't actually need to convince people to vote for them. They just need to convince people not to vote for their opponents. And that's because they don't actually need to meet any particular benchmark. They just need to get the most votes. And so negative campaigning is a super useful strategy under a plurality system. And unfortunately, negative campaigning also has the impact of making voters really disgusted with politics and not want to participate, which is not good. So already we're starting to see negative campaigning in the Republican primary, especially targeting DeSantis. And then this is a little blurb about the Illinois governor election, the most recent one, and it's talking about how the Democratic candidate was actually funding attack ads during the Republican primary against the more moderate Republican candidate, which is a bit ironic. So people were accusing the governor of trying to set up a general election between himself, the Democratic candidate, and the more extreme Republican candidate, because then people would not want to vote for the more extreme candidate. And so that's another example of how plurality voting can contribute to some strange behaviors from a democratic standpoint. All right, So then the question is, now that we have established that there's all these issues with plurality voting, what are we going to do instead? And so the alternative that we're going to talk about today is ranked choice voting. And if you use ranked choice voting, there's a few ways to count up the votes, but usually when people are talking about it, they mean instant runoff voting. So that's what we're going to talk about. Here's how it works. So first, all of the voters are going to rank the candidates. So they're going to say, this candidate is my first choice, this candidate is my second choice, and so on. Then we're going to look at the votes, and whichever candidate has the fewest first place votes is going to get removed from the election. And then we're going to look at all the ballots where that dropped candidate was ranked first, and we're going to move all the other candidates on the ballot up. And then we're going to look again, we're going to say, does anybody have the majority of the first place votes? And if not, we're going to repeat the process until somebody does. So I'll walk you through an example of that. Maybe, okay. So up here, you can see the first box up there is our initial vote counts. And just so you know what you're looking at, there's 5 people who ranked A, then C, then D, then B. There's 7 people who ranked B, then D, then A, then C. So if you look up there, you can see that only 3 people said that candidate C was their first choice, and that's the fewest, so we remove candidate C. And then we're going to shift all the other candidates up 1 spot, and we have a new vote tally. All right, but we still don't have any candidate with the majority of the first place votes. So now we're going to observe that candidate B only has 7 first place votes, and that is the fewest. And so we remove candidate B. And then, once again, we're going to shift all of the other candidates up. And that gives us this last box right here, which is our final vote tally. And you can see that candidate A has 9 first place votes, and candidate D has 15 first place votes. So candidate D would win the election. So here is a real life example, and it comes from Alaska. So different states in the US can decide how they want to run their own elections. And a little while ago, Alaska actually switched to this ranked choice voting. And this was one of their first elections that was really big after they switched. It was a special election to fill the Alaska House seat in the House of Representatives. So there was 3 candidates. There was Mary Peltola from the Democratic Party, Nick Begich from the GOP, and Sarah Palin from the GOP. And you can see up here what the election results were. So just based on the first place votes, Mary Peltola got 40% of them, Nick Begich got 28%, and Sarah Palin got 31%. So if we were using just a plurality voting system, Mary Peltola would have won, but we would have suspected that there was vote splitting going on in the Republican Party. However, because it was a ranked choice voting election, we can look at that a little bit more critically. So you can see here that in fact, a significant portion of the voters who ranked Nick Begich first actually broke with their party to rank Mary Peltola second instead of Sarah Palin. And as a result, Mary Peltola got 51.5% of the vote in the final round, and so she won the House seat. So that's a real life example, and it's one of the bigger elections or more publicized elections that used ranked choice voting. Okay, so now that you know what ranked choice voting is, why is it better? The first reason that it's better is that it requires majority support. So as you could see in the last example, Mary Peltola didn't win until she had more than 50% of the vote. The other great thing about instant runoff voting is that it removes the issues with spoiler effect and vote splitting. And that's great because it helps with third parties and independent candidates, and it also encourages positive campaigning. And the reason it encourages positive campaigning is that candidates want to rank as highly as possible on as many ballots as possible. So even if a voter isn't going to rank them first, they want the best chance they can to be second or third on that person's ballot. So if they're bashing their other candidates, especially if they're bashing somebody's favorite candidate, that person is pretty unlikely to rank them highly. And as a result, candidates are going to be a bit more positive. Okay, so here is an example that will illustrate why instant runoff removes the spoiler effect. So suppose that candidates A and C are similar, but that C doesn't really have a chance of winning. Maybe they're not from a mainstream party, or maybe they just don't have as much support. So here are the initial vote counts. And you can see that 45 people have ranked A first, 48 ranked B first, and 7 ranked C first. So under plurality voting, candidate B would have won, but we would say that candidate C is a spoiler for candidate A. But instead, this is ranked choice voting, so we remove candidate C from the election. And then we retally our votes, and now you can see that candidate A has 52 first place votes, and candidate B has 48. So candidate A will win because they have 52 out of the 100 votes in the election. And that's great because it means that candidate C didn't spoil the election for candidate A. Then this is a fun little headline about 2 candidates in a ranked choice voting elections who actually endorsed each other. And that's just an example of that positive campaigning that we were talking about earlier. All right, so instant runoff sounds great, but unfortunately there is some opposition. So we're going to talk about that. So there's a few criticisms of instant runoff voting, and the first one is that it's time intensive. And this is true. It does take quite a bit longer to get election results from an instant runoff election because it might have to go through several rounds. So sometimes it'll take a week, sometimes 2. And that is, mildly annoying. But I guess it's sort of strange to sacrifice the welfare of our democracy so that we can have election results on the night of the election instead of 2 weeks later. Another criticism is that instant runoff voting is complex. And this is true. It is a bit more complex because people have to rank candidates instead of just voting for their favorite one. But if people are unhappy with that situation or genuinely just too confused and don't want to figure it out, they can just rank first their favorite candidate and turn in their ballot. But also, it's not that complicated and people can learn it. There's plenty of places where ranked choice voting has been introduced and people have been able to successfully learn how to vote. And the last criticism is that it is a liberal plot. This is not a valid criticism at all because the system doesn't have any inherent bias towards candidates from one party or another or one ideological perspective or another. Any candidate, regardless of their political leaning, would have the same chance in a ranked choice voting election. All right, so right now, instant runoff has actually been catching on. If you look at this map, you can see that the pink circles are cities that are using ranked choice voting, and the light purple states are ones where ranked choice voting is used in some local elections. And then Alaska and Maine are the dark purple, and they both actually use ranked choice voting in their statewide elections. So it's definitely catching on. And yeah, one of the places where it is catching on is actually in Boston. There's a new push for ranked choice voting that's actually going on right now. So you can keep an eye out for that. And it is also gaining popularity throughout the country, as these headlines illustrate. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was very amazing. We do have time for 2 to 3 questions from the audience. So if you have any, feel free to raise your hand and we'll run a mic over to you. Any questions? Or from YouTube. We do have a live stream going on. Give you a couple seconds to think. Yes. Ooh, amazing. Thank you.
So, have there been projections on like larger scales major elections like presidency votings, if we use the ranked choice system, how that might shift current dynamics, or if it would be able to ease the divisiveness of party elections right now?
Yeah, so we know from past elections that there have been instances where elections were spoiled by independent or third-party candidates. So if we switched, we can reasonably expect that that would stop happening. And we also kind of can theorize that maybe like people would be more open to independent candidates. And if we were to move to this on a nationwide scale, I don't know that there's been any like mathematical projections all the way out, but based on what we know about the systems, we can conclude that there would be some shifting in terms of the abilities of independent candidates to run. And then also like you might see multiple candidates from the same party running because they're not worried about that vote splitting issue, which people think might be able to limit some of like the extremeness or that we see that as a result of primaries only selecting one candidate from their party. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe I'll add just a word. So one of the reasons that independent candidates run, even though they know they're not going to win the presidency, is they hope to get 5% of the votes. If you get 5% of the votes, you are eligible for federal campaign funds in the next election cycle. So with instant runoff, people not being afraid to put independent candidates first, there's really a much greater chance that independent candidates might hit that 5% mark of first place votes, thereby kind of boosting their next campaign 4 years later or something. So that's a big impetus.
So if we were to put in place like ranked choice voting nationally, like what would the mechanisms for that be?
So like how would we move to that system?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this is a great question. So if we, Cammy will talk about later, if we wanted to like get rid of the Electoral College and use instant runoff presidential elections, that would take a constitutional amendment. But we don't have to go all the way there. So as I talked about with Alaska, they actually switched to instant runoff elections in their state. So this is a decision that could be made state by state, and then states get to choose how their Electoral College votes are going to be used. So, you know, Massachusetts could say, we're going to use instant runoff voting, and then whoever the winner is, based on our instant runoff, they're going to get all of our Electoral College votes. So yeah, it can be implemented state by state. So that's something to think about because that makes it a little bit more feasible than having to get a constitutional amendment. Thank you.
for maybe one more question, if there are any. Yeah.
I just have a quick question on how this would affect voter turnout, if there's any research on that, because I know it's already pretty low in the United States, and I think switching to a little bit of a more confusing system for people might affect voter turnout, but I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, so that is definitely a concern. But there are also people who, I don't know that there's been research into this, but there's also an argument that it would actually boost voter turnout. And that's because, like we talked about with the negative campaigning, that part of the reason we see really low voter turnout is that people are so disgusted and disillusioned. So that might be one way that it could boost voter turnout. And another thing is that people get to vote for candidates who are actually their favorite because they don't have to worry about wasting their vote. And so that's something that people suspect could also cause an instant runoff system to boost voter turnout. But, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there are any other like foreign countries that have implemented ranked choice voting, and if so, to what effect has it been successful in those countries?
You know, I actually don't know the answer to that. Do you know, Professor Rolich?
Yes, there are a bunch of countries that use it too, and it's successful everywhere. So Scotland, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, and then other countries use it not for big elections, like Slovenia uses it. I forget. So there's a handful more that use it for certain kinds of elections. And universally, it's successful, and it doesn't. New Zealand actually switched from plurality to instant runoff about 25 years ago, and it's been great.
A huge shout out to Leah for that amazing talk. Thanks so much. Now we're transitioning to our next amazing speaker, giving a talk on PR for PR, how proportional representation can save our democracy. I'm excited to introduce another IMD fellow, Gabby Mackiewicz.
Hello. Hi. So today I'm going to be talking to you about proportional representation. So what's the issue? As Leah talked about, as we just heard, there's lots of issues with plurality. Plurality, the candidate who gets the most votes wins. Seems nice, not nice, as Leah described. Because it doesn't always accurately reflect the opinions of voters. This goes hand in hand with our first past the post voting system, where there's only one winner per district, and those single member districts are generally really unfair because of plurality. So while Leah talked about presidential elections a lot, we're going to be switching gears a little bit. We're looking solely at congressional elections and other legislative elections. So there's many different types of proportional representation, or PR, but in general, it refers to, Oops. Okay. So, switching gears, sorry. So we're going to look at some examples of this unfairness of plurality in our single member districts. So up here we have a map of Massachusetts. And as we can see, every single one of the 9 congressional districts are held by a Democrat. That is an issue because 30% of the state is Republican. So those Republican voters don't have any representation in Congress. And we see the opposite happening in Oklahoma. They have 5 congressional districts, and all of them are held by Republicans, despite the fact that 30% of the state is Democrat. So those 30% of Massachusetts Republicans and 30% Oklahoma Democrats. None of them are represented in Congress. So that's an issue. And what can we do instead? Well, here's where we come to proportional representation, and more specifically, multi-member districts. So with multi-member districts, because you would have larger districts that have multiple winners, so instead of just one, it's easier for candidates to get elected because the threshold, like the number of votes that you need, is lower. So it really opens up for a lot more wide range of candidates to run and actually have a chance of getting elected. Have more niche platforms run. Things maybe you want to run solely for abortion rights or on a platform for climate change advocacy. Or you can also have more third-party candidates. The Green Party might actually have a chance because, as Leah discussed, as of now, if you were to run on a campaign like that now, it would kind of be pointless because we have these two major parties that can control everything. So we have a lot of different forms of PR, but the main idea is that the number of seats a party wins is proportional to the number of votes it receives in congressional elections. So a little example for you. If we had like 3 parties running, you might have Party A, if they win 30% of the votes, then they get 30% of the seats. If Party B has 25% of the votes, they get 25% of the seats. C, 45% of the votes, 45% of the seats. Makes sense. That makes sense. So going back to Massachusetts, for example, we have our 9 districts. So with this, for example, we can instead have 3 larger districts and then have 3 winners in each district. And hopefully that should make it easier for those for Massachusetts Republicans who currently have no representation to actually win and get some representation that is more proportional to the number of Republicans in Massachusetts. And, most democracies in the world use PR. There is a historical basis for this. As you've seen the world map, every country that is in orange uses some form of PR for some of their elections. So if it's so great, why don't we use proportional representation? Well, there are some technical issues that you can run into. One, if districts are too big, then there's too many people that the representatives are trying to represent, and they can't adequately represent the people. On the other hand, if districts are too small and you have too few winners from each district, the entry bar to win is too high, and you kind of run into like similar problems as you do with plurality and single-member districts. There's also some more political Party and the Republican Party, and they benefit greatly from our two-party system, and switching to PR would mean that they have less power, and they don't want to lose that power. So they don't really have incentive to want to change the current two-party system. And further with that, PR tends to hurt incumbents. Currently, as we know, politicians' main concern, maybe not main concern, but big concern is getting reelected. So that means kind of, there are all issues with that. But with PR, because of that lower threshold and more wide array of candidates and parties that can be elected, while it's also easier to win, it's just as easy to lose. And incumbents have a higher chance of losing their seats, which they don't want. So they wouldn't have as much incentive to want to move to PR. And there's also legislative hurdles. The Uniform Congressional District Act of 1967 mandated single-member districts to be used in congressional elections. So actually implementing multi-member districts and PR in the U.S. would require a bill to be passed. But we can do that. So while there are disadvantages, as we saw, to PR, there is also plenty of advantages that we'll get into now. One, it limits partisanship. So as we know currently, there are plenty, as like in Massachusetts with the 30% Republicans who don't have representation, and Oklahoma with the Democrats. There are plenty of places across the United States where the state and districts are solidly red or solidly blue, and their elections really aren't contested. So that means voters in those districts who support the minority party, their vote kind of doesn't matter. And so with PR, because you have those bigger districts with the multiple winners, more elections can go contested and actually have a chance of, flipping the parties. And you can have districts that aren't just one color. You can have purple districts where we get maybe 2 Democrats and a Republican in one district or something like that, where it's not all from one party. And with that, with the lower threshold to win, we have the potential to eliminate the 2-party system, which is so fun. It's easier for smaller parties to win seats with PR, and so that means that the total parties represented can really be diversified, and we can end up with something more like this, with many different colors in our congressional makeup instead of the solidly red and blue like in the last slide. And going back to Leah's presentation as well, PR also limits negative campaigning and has more coalition building. So because there are multiple winners from each district, the people you're running against, you have a chance of working with them in the future. So you have less incentive to bash them on the campaign trail if you're going to be working with them a few months down the line. And so it also has more coalition building because of the smaller parties and more niche platforms that can be run. So you get a much wider array of ideas and people in Congress, and you don't have this strict, all the Democrats work with other Democrats and all the Republicans work with other Republicans, and the less polarization, and we're working together. And representatives are also held more accountable. Currently, it's kind of a candidate can run with big, lofty ideas in their platform, and then they can get elected and throw it all away and never come back to their campaign promises. And that's just kind of fine. We live with that. But with PR, because it's so easy to get elected and also lose your seat, candidates have more incentive to stick to their promises and actually do what they say they're going to do. Further, with proportional representation, your vote actually really matters. Is even if you don't favor the majority candidate. So even if your candidate that you support doesn't get the most votes, doesn't mean that they don't still have a chance of winning. Further, PR lessens the divide between rural and urban voters. So currently, Republicans tend to be more in less populated districts and more spread out in rural areas, and Democrats tend to be in more densely populated districts and urban areas. So this means that Republicans have more chances to win, like, larger districts that are less populated, But with PR, where you're from, what the size of your district not the size of your district, but the population density of your district doesn't actually matter, and all votes are treated equally. It also limits gerrymandering. I won't get too much into the details because Janaki will be talking about gerrymandering next. But because of the bigger districts with multiple winners, PR would make it a lot harder for district lines to be redrawn in a way that favors one party over another. And the next point, which I think is most important, is that PR allows for a wide and more diverse range of people and ideas that can feasibly win. More women, more people of color, and other members of marginalized groups have a better chance of being elected. And as we'll see in a bit, there's statistics to prove that. And overall, PR actually is shown to boost voter participation because of things like limiting negative campaigning and elected officials being held more accountable. People feel more inclined to actually want to participate in our democracy. And that also goes hand in hand with the more diverse representation in Congress, because people want to see people like them elected. So some cool statistics for us, if it will go. Under PR, studies have shown that women are 2 times more likely to be elected. Black representatives are 25% more likely to be elected, 25% more Black representatives are elected, and 40% more Latinx representatives are elected. So it's shown that when elected officials from marginalized groups are in Congress, they act in the interests of their marginalized group, and so to have that representation in Congress is really great for making sure that everyone in the U.S. is adequately represented. So now we're going to go into a little bit of how it works election-wise. So one method for PR is single transferable vote. It is a form of instant runoff, remember from Leah's presentation, except it's more generalized to fit multiple candidates, or the multiple winners, sorry. And it relies on a win threshold or win quota. So based on the number of people who voted and the numbers of seats to be won, there is a quota figured out that each candidate has to pass in order to win. So let's see. So let's say we have a ballot that looks like this. We have 5 candidates: plum, rust, apricot, violet, and lavender. And single transferable vote, like instant runoff, which it comes from, is a ranked choice voting system. So voters would rank their candidates, and we're trying to, in this example, elect 3 winners. We have 3 seats to fill. So people vote, people rank their people, and let's say we have something like this. So here we see with the number of votes we have and the number of seats to be filled, our win threshold is 25%. So that means that after a candidate reaches 25% of the votes, they win a seat. And then, like instant runoff, they are taken out of the election. And then with the remaining votes over the win threshold, we take those votes and then we split them up proportionally among the remaining candidates. So we see Plum has over 25%, they have 35% of the vote. Just looking at first choices. So that means Plum is a winner. And then that extra chunk of votes above 25% are going to be distributed proportionally to the rest of the candidates. So let's see what that looks like. We get this. So now we see that Rust has also reached 25% of the votes. So that means that Rust is also a winner. Yay. But here we run into a little bit of a problem. Rust has exactly 25%. They didn't go over the win threshold. They reached it, so they won, but they didn't go over, so there's no excess votes to be redistributed. So what do we do now? Well, we can see Lavender has the least amount of votes, only 12%. So since they're the lowest, just like an instant runoff, we can drop them and then take their votes and then redistribute them based on the other rankings for the other two candidates. And then we'll end up with something like this. So now we see our final winner is Violet. After moving all of Lavender's votes, the Violet reaches 30%. That is over the win threshold. So Violet is our final winner. That means with this example, we have Plum, Rust, and Violet that are elected. So that was a fun example, but it's very hypothetical. A single transferable vote is actually used right nearby in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So Cambridge City Council elections and also their school board elections use STV, and they're actually voting today for City Council. And so people of Cambridge will go to a voting booth and see something like this. And I'll admit, looks kind of daunting. There's a lot of people, a lot of bubbles. They're filling 9 seats, so you have a lot of people running to fill those 9 seats. But we'll say, like Leah said, you're under no obligation with ranked choice voting systems to rank every single candidate. You can rank as many or as few as you want. And all of that work we did in the previous slides, where you move them all around, is all done by a computer. So it'll be done. Not to worry. So the way that they find their candidates, the quota for who wins, is they look at the number of valid ballots or the number of voters over the number of people to be elected. So that's like the number of seats that are up. So number of seats plus 1, and then all of that plus 1 will give you the quota. And so once candidates have that many votes, then they win. This is actually called the droop quota, which is the most common one used. And a great thing about it is that it's impossible for using this quota to end up with more than 9 winners, or more winners than you have seats for in general. So Cambridge has been using STV for a long time. This map is from 2017, the city council election then. As we can see, the map shows all of the winners, and it has a little house for where they live, and then corresponding colors of where their votes came from. And as we can see, we have this natural neighborhood effect, where the supporters for each winner come from the people who live around them, for the most part. And this really shows just how much proportional representation goes for actually electing people who truly represent their constituents. This is literally people in their direct communities who elected them. And this has really worked for Cambridge, and I believe it can work for plenty of other places too. They've been using it since 1941, I believe, for their municipal elections, and since they've seen a much better increase in Black people elected, more women elected than other systems. So it's really beneficial and a really great way to have a much more fair and representative election. So, thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation. Do you have any questions?
So for the multi-member districts, is that to elect the dual representatives, is that like the district is split up into two smaller districts and a separate election is run in each, or is it like one just single election for the entire district and like the first place and the second place winners become the representatives?
The second one. So you'll have one election, and then from that election, you'll have multiple winners. So say you're electing 3 people, everyone votes, you vote for one person, and then from that, you look at the top 3 kind of, and then you have 3 winners all from that same voting pool.
And then in that situation would ranked choice, if ranked choice voting was used in those dual elections, would it be less effective or more effective?
More effective. Ranked choice voting is basically like, to move it, that's basically the single transferable vote example I showed. That's single transferable vote is like the generalization of ranked choice voting for multi-member elections, multi-winner elections, sorry. So it still works. I don't know if you need the mic.
Over there.
I can speak loud too. You're good. Okay. Thank you so much. You're good.
I was wondering if you could give some more clarity on how seats would be divided if the winning percentage is a decimal, as in like if 50.9% of the party wins and then 49.1%. Like, does that like make sense?
I think I get what you're saying. So I mean, unless you have 100 people in the district, then like 50% isn't always going to be 50 people or an exact number of people anyway. So that's always, no matter how you do it, it's always going to be slightly off from the number of people. But it doesn't really matter if you have decimals. It's perfectly fine. The math works.
I'm kind of thinking, what happens when the representatives are making a decision for the district? If there's 3 representatives of the same district, like, do they come up with a consensus? Does one kind of take the lead if they have like the most of the proportion? Like, what happens there?
Since we're looking at congressional elections, I mean, a lot of it isn't like super specific to your actual like district. Of course, you want to work, if you're an elected official, you want to work in the best interest of your constituents. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing stuff like for your actual district. That would be other elections. So all these people just kind of work independently, and yeah.
Hey, thank you so much, Gabby. Huge round of applause. After these 2 amazing talks, I just want to flag that we have 2 more just as wonderful about the Electoral College and gerrymandering happening in just a few minutes. But we figured we could take a 2-minute break just so you all can stock up on apple cider and cookies and whatever berries may or may not be left, just before we dive right into these next amazing topics. So please stick around, and we'll come back at around 6:05. See you then. I am very excited to introduce our next speaker, Janaki Kapadia, who will be talking about geography, gerrymandering, and democracy. So a warm welcome. Thanks so much.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about gerrymandering, as Ilinka said. So let's just start out with this map. This is the 2021 proposed congressional districts of the state of Massachusetts. And some of these look like normal congressional districts you see on the news all the time. But if you look closely near like where the Boston area is, you kind of see that there's a lot of weird shapes and a lot of funkiness going on, especially with District 8, this area surrounding the Boston area. So this is a form of gerrymandering. So what is gerrymandering? It's a form of, so every 10 years, states will redraw their congressional and legislative districts lines according to the results of the census. And this has been happening for as long as American politics and the legislative system has been around. And this has a pretty good, there's a pretty good reason why this happens every 10 years. Demographics of states and regions and cities might change, and it's helpful to redraw these lines to reflect the needs of the people of the district. And the point of this is so that people who might be minorities or, you know, the general needs and interests of an area can be reflected well in terms of who they're electing to Congress. So for example, if a community is like their main industry is fishing, it might be helpful for them to have a representative in Congress who is really pushing for economic benefits for that community. However, this practice of allowing states and governments of the states to be able to redraw these lines, this has been manipulated and not used for the best purposes. This is often done to benefit political parties rather than protecting the needs and interests of voters. And so gerrymandering has been around, and these elected parties will manipulate these boundaries. This will create an unfair advantage for political parties that are in the minority or might not have power during the year that these new lines are drawn, as well as voters of certain groups and socioeconomic classes whose needs might not always be considered by the party that's in power and wants to remain elected. So a bit of history of gerrymandering. The term is a mashup of the word salamander and the name of Albert Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812. The term comes because this cartoon came out in an editorial of this very funky map he drew of these districts in the Boston area, and the shape kind of looks like a salamander. It's been used for, again, like I said, since the beginning of American politics. However, the usage of it has fluctuated. It started being used a lot more during the end, after the Civil War ended, and especially the passage of the 15th Amendment, which allowed for universal male suffrage and allowed for African American men to be able to vote. And a lot of politicians who weren't serving the needs of these people but still wanted to stay in power started to use these tactics to be able to stay in power without needing to consider the needs of these people. The use of gerrymandering went down a bit because states found other ways to repress voters, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, other ways to disenfranchise voters. However, during the Civil Rights Movement, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all of these measures to disenfranchise voters, such as poll taxes, all of that, that was abolished, and so was gerrymandering for racial purposes, that you can't draw lines in a way to hurt a racial group. However, in recent years, especially with the rise of computer technology, I'll get to this later, gerrymandering has resurged because it's become a lot more convenient to be able to engage in it and be able to draw these district lines in a smart way. So what counts as gerrymandering? Like I said, there is a distinction between drawing lines to serve the interests and needs of a voter versus doing it for political gain. It's generally helpful to draw lines to reflect the needs of community that might be in need, that might not be fully represented in Congress. But what the trend has become that voters are picking, instead of voters picking their politicians, politicians are picking their voters. And politicians will try to manipulate who's in these districts and who they think is going to vote for them, and they will pick these voters beforehand so they know that they'll be able to stay in power or get elected without really having to cater much to what people actually want. So yeah, this results in situations where parties pick the voters by cutting up these districts. And if the manipulation is done well enough, minorities can end up seeming like majorities, and the voices of both minorities and majorities, depending on the case, will be completely cut out. So, how is gerrymandering done? One of the main method is through packing and cracking. So what does this mean? Parties will manipulate these lines by packing and cracking votes into districts. What this cracking involves diluting the power of an opposing party by spreading them across many districts so they're represented in none. So every district will have a few votes or a couple thousand of voters who are of the opposing party, but compared to the population of the district, they really do not, when they go to the polling station, it really doesn't matter that much in comparison to people who will be voting for the party in power. On the other hand, packing involves concentrating all of these opposing votes into a few districts, so even if they're represented in a few districts, in the broad scheme of things, their votes really do not matter. And so they do have a voice in their small area, but in the broader scheme, they're disenfranchised. And this is often used to protect incumbents. This is done by both parties again, and people who are in power want to stay in power. So, okay, there you go, sorry. Okay, so this is an example of how packing and cracking are done in an election. So let's say that we have 50 precincts, and we want to split these up into 5 districts. So you would think that under normal circumstances, if there are 60 precincts of the 50 precincts are blue and 40% are red, then we would have 30 blue precincts, 20 red precincts, and then we would get 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. However, if you do a good job, you can end up getting 5 blue districts and 0 red districts, or end up making the red districts win. So here, essentially the vote has been cracked in this example, where the red vote is spread across these 5 districts, so there are red votes in each district, but it's not enough in any of them for them to be able to count and win that particular district. On the other hand, this is an example of packing where essentially the blue votes have been packed into 2 districts, and then the spread pretty thinly across the other ones so that the red votes end up seeming like a majority, and then in the end, red wins the election. So there has been an increasing trend in which both parties have been using gerrymandering to favor incumbents. Often parties will work with one another, so if one party is in power in one state, they'll still work with the other to make sure that their incumbents are protected, and new candidates bursting onto the scene don't really have a chance. And this was done, a lot of things happened in the 2000 election, but especially 2000 was a year where redistricting was done, and this made a lot of districts extremely non-competitive. So, looking to the midterm elections that happened last year, this is a graph from 538, and we can see that only 40 of these seats were highly competitive, and most districts across the country were either solid Democrat or solid Republican, so there's really no change from the status quo. Looking to 2024, we can see that only 24 districts are a toss-up out of like the 435 congressional districts in the country, and most of them are solid Democrat and solid Republican and are not likely to become very contested. So usually the incumbent will end up winning because there's usually no one in the party wants to win against them, and then in the general election, they'll end up holding the seat. So here are some other funky district maps, but here's where the math comes in, because how do you exactly quantify as funky, and when is it too funky that you can tell that maybe there is political gerrymandering taking place? So how does one measure gerrymandering? Well, mathematicians have developed multiple ways to try to measure gerrymandering. This is through maybe studying efficiency gaps or studying the geometry of districts to be able to measure how irregular these shapes are and decide whether there's a number we can assign that as a threshold that this is where too much gerrymandering has been done, and then anything above that is, okay, this was intentional. Yeah. So one way of doing this is looking at efficiency gaps. So what this does is, I talked about cracking and packing, and we see if how many votes from each party are being wasted, as in people voted in this election, but then at the end of the day, their party didn't end up winning. And if we're seeing gaps in terms of in certain elections, there isn't that much of a margin, but in others, there is a big margin, we can probably assume that there was some amount of like intentional gerrymandering done to make sure that these votes don't end up counting. So efficiency gaps, studying an efficiency gap will compare the difference in two parties' wasted votes and compare it to the total number of votes cast in the election. Another way of studying whether gerrymandering has been done is looking at compactness scores. So we can try to quantify whether districts are reasonably shaped, whether they're not too stretched out. Again, there are certain rules as to how districts can be drawn up. One of them is that you can't have holes in districts, you can't split up counties, you have to keep the number, like the population of a district. They all kind of have to be similar, but you can try to stretch them out and like thin them in order to include the votes that you want and exclude the ones that you don't. And so we can try to see how bad of like a job this was. And so we can study unnatural indentations, thinness, etc. And a high area to perimeter ratio might indicate that district lines were deliberately drawn, and this was an intentional job of gerrymandering. So there are a few different formulas in order to study this. The Paulsby-Popper score, which is over here in this diagram, we can see that a circle has a Paulsby-Popper score of 1 because it's a pretty compact design, everything is contained within it. And then this shape over here on the right has a very low Paulsby-Popper score because we still have the same amount of area, but it's stretched all the way over. The Rioch score and Schwartzberg score, and these are various formulas that we can use to try to determine this. Another trend that's been emerging in the study and process of gerrymandering and redrawing district lines is computerization. Computers make it a lot easier for like very intricate quantitative work to be done on these. And so gerrymandering has been turned into a science, essentially. Computer algorithms will allow for parties to make maps that will favor them in all but the most extreme circumstances. So you can have a program which, you can control for various variables of an election, maybe look at different policy issues, and make sure that across all of these potential situations that might come up that might endanger the party, the candidate will almost always win because the district has been drawn up in such a way. We can run through various scenarios using computerization. However, there is increasing research into using methods of big data in order to crack down on gerrymandering. So a lot of researchers, what they're doing now is they're developing these programs where they can generate millions of these unbiased maps of districts and then look at the district map in question and say, okay, is this similar to any of these? And if it's not, there's a possibility that the party wasn't really looking for fair, impartial districts and was intentionally messing with it in order to create a situation where they will end up winning. So of course, there are issues with trying to quantify gerrymandering. Of course, there are going to be issues with having a number and saying that if this is above or below, then this is an example of gerrymandering, or this is not, an end of discussion. However, it is a good starting point to understand where and why gerrymandering is happening. Okay. So, moving to legal battles over gerrymandering. So, there have been many cases and developments happening in the courts currently over the constitutionality of gerrymandering. So, one issue is that racial gerrymandering is illegal under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, there are questions over whether political gerrymandering is okay or not. So far, the current Supreme Court is right of center in terms of its leaning, and it's been pretty dismissive of cases regarding racial gerrymandering. So 5 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that it cannot review partisan gerrymandering claims and sent these back to the state legislators to be decided upon. So this case was Rucho v. Common Cause. It was a landmark Supreme Court case decided 5 years ago in response to this new district map for the 12th Congressional District of North Carolina. So as you can see, it's pretty spread out over the state. You can assume that there was a deliberate job done. The court ruled that even if partisan gerrymandering may be incompatible with democratic principles, they could not make decisions or review these cases because they were too political for the court to be able to rule on. So the court has ruled this before, that if both parties are doing political gerrymandering, it's kind of not a problem for them. If both are engaging in it, it's too political for them. You can't really tell anything from these mathematical deviations, and so the state legislators can decide about this. And this 5-4 judgment was ruled along ideological lines. However, in recent years, so this year, on October 11th, the Supreme Court heard another voting rights case, Alexander versus South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP. And this case came out over the question of whether the South Carolina legislature, which is currently controlled by the Republican Party, deliberately took out thousands of black voters from the 1st Congressional District. So, like I said, there's this debate over where the line between racial and political gerrymandering is, and so this is a case where there was deliberate steps taken to disenfranchise thousands of black voters. The state argues that this was only done to make the election more secure for Republicans, which is okay by the courts as long as it's just political. So the question does come down to race. And this was also one of the first districts where computer models were used in the litigation process, and there was a lot of, these computer-generated maps that I mentioned that were being used in these discussions. There's also a case currently, Allen versus Milligan, in Alabama. In 2021, Alabama, the legislature modified districts to account for population shifts, and they were sued that they violated the Voting Rights Act and also the 14th Amendment. And 2 of these cases ended up going to the district court, where Alabama was told, you need to redraw your maps to have not 1, but 2 black majority districts. And Alabama ended up appealing this case to the Court of Appeals, and then it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And then in June of this year, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Alabama's districts probably violated the Voting Rights Act, and they need to redraw another majority-minority district to empower black voters. However, those maps have not come out yet. It's November, and voters are still waiting. So as we can see, math is increasingly becoming part of this judicial story. It's no longer just about, hypotheticals about what counts as gerrymandering, what's legal and what's not legal, but we see a lot of these models being used in litigation. So looking into the 2024 election, as the battle over gerrymandering continues in court, it could impact congressional maps in Georgia and North Carolina, as both are being asked to redraw their maps as of now. This is happening in other states as well, and if the makeups of these districts is affected, it could potentially impact outcomes in Congress in the upcoming 2024 election, and it would force a lot of people to reconsider which states are traditional Republican or Democrat strongholds, and sort of shake up these models about which district is going to go solidly Democrat and which ones are competitive or solidly Republican. Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, and New York are also in the middle of gerrymandering related battles, and this could really, again, these shakeups could alter the makeup of Congress as we looked at 2024. So, yeah, that's all I had. Thank you. Yeah, I can take any questions.
Thanks so much. I was wondering, because a lot of districting is done by politicians, it's inherently often kind of a flawed process, even just from that lens. So I was wondering, I've heard a bit about independent redistricting commissions and other efforts to try to make them more transparent or impartial. I was wondering if you could share some ways that legislatures can try to make that process more fair?
Yeah, that's, like you mentioned, independent commissions have been talked about a lot. In terms of the Supreme Court, there was, Neil Gorsuch actually asked that, if someone could, provide, solid, mathematical evidence that this was happening, he would be, willing to look into further, actual constitutional changes. But yeah, that's one of the big ideas that people are talking about, that not letting the party who's in power during that year of redistricting have the power to decide all these major decisions, but having people from all parties come and sit together and do this. So.
I just want to add what Alinka said about the independent redistricting commissions. There was an example in Michigan in 2020 where before 2020 there had been extreme gerrymandering, but in response to this gerrymandering, Michigan implemented a independent commission just made up of 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and some number of independents. And then after 2020, in the next election cycle, 2022, you could physically see the lines on the map had just become much more normal looking, and gerrymandering had been almost completely eliminated.
There you go.
Can you tell that he's my son?
Thank you so much. Another round of applause for Janaki. That was amazing. And last but most certainly not least, I am very excited to introduce our final presentation called Worst College Ever by Cammy Zhou. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Cammy, and today I will be talking about the Electoral College and its deficiencies through a mathematical perspective. So I will start with a brief history of the Electoral College system. At the 1787 Constitutional Convention, there were a lot of debates around how to elect the president. Various methods were proposed, including a national popular vote and an election by Congress or a subset of Congress. And after days of debates, the delegates decided that the issue was not resolvable, so they passed it onto the Committee on Unfinished Parts. Eventually, the committee was able to come up with a solution known as the Electoral College. And to form an Electoral College, each state were to choose a group of electors the size of the state's delegation in Congress, which is the state's number of House representatives plus 2 for the senators. And this way, the Electoral College is essentially a copy of the Congress. This solution was actually a compromise between the South and the North. While the northern states were generally in support of a national popular vote, the southern states strongly favored a more centralized decision. And the historical context for this is that the 3/5 compromise has just been established. The agreement was that while slaves cannot actually vote, they can count towards the state's population. So the result was an overrepresentation of the southern states in Congress. And that is why they favored a more centralized decision by a political body modeled after the Congress. So we could also say that the Electoral College is a legacy of slavery. With that in mind, here is the roadmap for the rest of my presentation. I will start with introducing the Electoral College, talking about how it works, and some of the issues that comes with the setup of the system. After that, I will discuss 2 major representations of how the Electoral College fail in practice. The first one is mismatching between electoral and popular vote. And the second one is unequal representation of individual voters. At the end, I will introduce 3 alternatives to the Electoral College system. All right, so I will start with talking about the Electoral College system. At the state level, a candidate only needs a plurality vote to win the state election and in order to receive electoral votes from that state. So this means that every presidential election involves 52 separate plurality elections. So all the bad things about plurality voting that Leah has talked about earlier can happen 52 times in a single presidential election. Adding on to that, the winning candidate in a particular state receives all the electoral votes from that state. This creates more state influence, but less representation for certain groups of people, in particular, the people who support the losing candidate in that state. And after holding all these statewide elections, at the national level, we take the majority winner of electoral vote. So you are required to receive at least 270 votes in order to win the election. And you might think, great, this is finally not plurality voting, but in this case, a majority voting method is actually very dangerous because we have a very high risk of having no winner, in which case there will be a contingent election where things can go very wrong. So in a contingent election, the lame duck House of Representatives vote for the president, with each state's delegation getting a single vote. So you have to agree on a certain candidate, otherwise you would lose your vote simply. And the vice president in this case will be selected by the Senate. So a fun scenario that could potentially happen is that our president and vice president are from 2 different parties. And contingent elections have in fact occurred several times in the history of US presidential elections. For example, in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, and also in 1824, when Andrew Jackson won plurality but not majority of the Electoral College votes. Both elections were very bizarre. Now we will take a look at the 2024 election that is coming up. So in fact, a contingent election is very likely to occur in 2024. First of all, we have the likely rematch between Biden and Trump, which will probably be a very tight race. And on top of that, we also have several solid third-party candidates who could potentially win a few electoral votes and contributing to a contingent election. So first up, we have Robert Kennedy running as an independent, and there's also Cornel West running as an independent. We also have the No Labels Party claiming that they could offer independent ticket in 2024. So bottom line, the 2024 election is not settled. This is from the No Labels Party website, but the point is that they're not wrong. If these third-party candidates can win a few electoral college votes, then a contingent election could easily happen. Now I will move on to talk about our first major way in which the Electoral College fails. So the state winner-take-all system causes disagreement between popular and electoral vote because whichever candidate wins in a state gets all the electoral votes from that state, no matter the margin with which that candidate wins. So an example of this is the 2016 election, where Clinton won the popular vote, looking like by 3 million, and Trump was able to win the presidency by winning the Electoral College. And such disagreement between popular and electoral vote is actually very undesirable, because here we can see that the result of the popular vote suggests that more people would like Clinton to be their president rather than Trump. However, the Electoral College system gave Trump an opportunity to be the president. So let's take a look at an example of how the state winner-take-all system can cause this disagreement. So still 2016 election, this table records the popular vote results in Michigan. As you can see, Trump won 47.3% of the vote, while Clinton won 47.0%. So it was very close. It was basically just a matter of a couple of thousands of people out of the total of 5 million people who voted in Michigan. So it was essentially a tie. But the Electoral College gave all the electoral votes of Michigan to Trump just because he won by a really small margin. And in fact, so as you can see in the map, the yellow states are states in which the votes that Trump and Clinton received are within 4 percentage points of each other. So they were basically tied in all those states. But most of the Electoral College votes in those states went to Trump because Trump won by a very small amount of votes. And had we counted those elections as tied in those states, then it would have been a very close election, if not a win for Clinton. So such mismatching between popular and electoral vote has happened 6 times in the history of US presidential elections, which is about 9% of all of them. And under reasonable assumptions, it is possible to win the election by winning only 23% of the total vote cast. Now, moving on to our second problem, which is violation of equal representation. So according to the Constitution, each representative in the House is supposed to account for roughly the same number of people. But this is not actually the case for two reasons. For one, every state is guaranteed at least one representative, no matter how small the state is. And for two, every state is also guaranteed 2 senator seats, completely regardless of the state's population sizes. And to see how that caused a problem, we will look at an example. This table here records the population counts and the number of electoral votes that the state of California and Wyoming have. Upon dividing the population counts by the number of electoral college votes that they had, we get population per electoral vote. So here it's saying that in California, every 732,000 of people get 1 electoral vote. And in Wyoming, every 192,000 of people get electoral votes. So that is a huge difference. With some simple calculation, we find that it takes 3.8 times as many people in California as in Wyoming to exert the same influence on the Electoral College. In other words, we might also say that Wyoming people have 3.8 times more voting power than people than Californians. So from the table, we saw the disparity between the voting power of people in California and people in Wyoming. But we can actually make the same comparison between all of the states. And here are the results. So this bar chart records the population per electoral vote across the states. And you can see here that California is on the far left, and on the far right, we have Wyoming. And then there's also everything that's in between. So one person, how many vote? Well, that depends on which state you live in. So from the last example, we saw quantitatively how people can have different voting powers in different states. Now here's another way to see this. This is the 2020 Electoral College map. And as you can see from the electoral votes, at the top, this was a win for Biden. But now, let's imagine this. Right before the presidential election, 5,000 Arizonian Democrats decide to move to their neighboring state, California, and 5,000 Californian Republicans decide to move to Arizona. And a similar swap happens between Georgia Democrats and Alabama Republicans, and Wisconsin Democrats and Minnesota Republicans. So to summarize this, a very small portion of the total population has moved to a different state. So no state's population count has changed, and no one's political opinion has changed. So everything that you would expect to matter in a presidential election has remained the same. However, here are the results. You can see that the result is flipped elections in 3 states, in Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia. So now Trump is winning in all those states. And even more surprisingly, the overall result is a tie between Biden and Trump, which would lead to contingent election. Of course, all of this is hypothetical, but it shows how people can have very different influence in different states. Having discussed all of those problems of the Electoral College system, I will now introduce 3 alternatives that we could potentially use. So ideally, we would abolish the Electoral College system and instead use a national popular vote with instant runoff. So this would eliminate all of the problems, things like spoiler effects, vote splitting or any wasted vote. And also, everyone would get an equal vote in the presidential election. Unfortunately, this is not feasible because it requires constitution amendment, which means that we need support from a majority of the delegations in Congress. But the problem is that the smaller states enjoy their overrepresentation in the Congress, and they would not want to abolish the system. So it could be very difficult to pass this constitutional amendment. Now, if we can abolish it, we could avoid it with a national popular vote interstate compact. This is a way around the Electoral College system, but achieving the same result as a national popular vote. So this is an agreement among a group of states to award all of their electoral votes to the popular vote winner in those states. For example, if, say, Biden won the popular vote in Massachusetts, but Trump was able to win the overall popular vote in all of the states that are in the compact, then Massachusetts would actually pledge to give all of its electoral votes to Trump instead of Biden. And so this compact is currently adopted by 16 states and the District of Columbia. But in order for this to actually work, we would need at least a total of 270 Electoral College votes. And right now we're at 205. But this might be very difficult because as for now, we have a lot of Democratic states in the compact. But in order to reach 270, we might need a few red or purple states to join the compact, which could be very difficult. Now, if neither of those work, we can still amend the system with proportional allocation, where we allocate electoral votes in each state according to the proportion of the statewide popular vote each candidate receives. So, for example, again, if in Massachusetts, say Biden wins 70% of the vote and Trump wins 30%, then we would give 70% of the Electoral College votes that Massachusetts have to Biden and the rest to Trump. So recall our earlier example of the 2016 election. In the state of Michigan, the election was very close for Clinton and Trump. So if we were to use proportional allocation, then we would actually allocate half of the votes that Michigan had to Trump and the other half to Clinton, which is great because no one's vote, or at least less people's votes, are wasted. And now I will end this presentation with a takeaway, that is, the Electoral College is mathematically deeply flawed and changes are required to promote fairness in our democracy. So thank you so much for listening.
Any questions?
Fun fact, while you're thinking about questions, the National Interstate Compact was dreamed up by the guy who invented scratch-off lottery tickets. And he learned about the compact because states have these lottery compacts, and he was a part of establishing these compacts, and he's like, oh, maybe we should do this for the Electoral College as well. Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering when that compact was established. Like, was that established after a recent election, or has that been in place in previous elections?
I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's before 2000.
I think so. It's been around for like 20, 30 years or something. But it's gained traction in the last 5 to 10 maybe.
You called it a proportional allocation, is that right?
Yes.
So would that have made a difference in the 2016 election? I mean, did anyone do a calculation?
I think it might because
It's not the same thing as a popular vote, right? It's slightly
No.
different, right?
because here I have this map. So I actually created this map using 270 to win. And so what I did was I said the election was undecided in all those yellow states. And it turned out that Clinton and Trump had very close number of votes. So I think it would have made a difference.
Although the other states would have had to distribute their votes proportionally as well.
Right.
That's a good question. So 530, it has this interactive thing where you can run the various elections using proportional representation or district-wise things or popular vote, etc. And some of that, I forget exactly what happens in 2016, but like 2 or 3 out of the last 6 elections would have turned out differently using proportional representation.
Thank you so much. A massive shout out and appreciation to all of our speakers. I have learned so much and am genuinely, I think, both informed and inspired going into 2024. It's going to be a wild ride, but I think the more knowledge that we have of these systems and the ways in which they're flawed, and also the ways that we can engage with them constructively the better we are as we face this contentious election season, as informed voters and also as agents of change. And I think what's especially amazing about what we heard today was we heard from students who are studying mathematics and political science and kind of digging into these intersections. So whether you're kind of coming at this event as a math person who wants to see how you can apply your skills to create legislative change, or as someone who's kind of been involved in advocacy in the social science or humanities side of it and also kind of wants to have this informed perspective, I think now more than ever, we really need to come together and dig into these intersections for quite literally the fate of our democracy. So I'm excited that we were able to do that here today, and I'm so grateful for all the amazing speakers. So another huge round of applause to all of them. Thank you.